Hello, there we go. Okay, so welcome back from the break. I'm temporarily resubbing in for Colin here because up next we have one of the newest members of Thinking About Thinking, who is also a professor at the University of Groningen, Lisa Marie Vortmann, who is going to give it a very eagerly anticipated talk on one hand because a new professor, a new member of Thinking About Thinking, on the other hand, because she's been brainstorming ideas about this through poster sessions over the last few days, I think has got a lot of people very interested. So Lisa, it's really a pleasure to welcome you to the organization, to welcome you to the conference. We're looking forward to the talk. When you're ready, the stage is yours. Thank you, Lisa.
I think I'm going to take the microphone. Is there something I need to do? Okay.
3, 2, 1.
I realize that this is a bit of a dramatic start to a scientific talk, but it's going to all make sense in a second. So my talk today is going to be about the concept of attention. And I chose this entrance for my talk because I was pretty confident that that was going to get me your attention. Now, did it work or did it not? I think my only estimate of that is how many of you actually looked at the screen based on the sound that they heard, or basically even looked at me a little bit confused because it was an unexpected beginning of a talk. Now, when I say I did this to get all of your guys' attention, then I think it makes sense why my title today is Everyone Knows What Attention Is. It's this concept that even if I don't really explain what I'm talking about, and even if I wasn't talking to a scientific audience, people intuitively have this understanding of attention. And that is something that I will actually try to question a little bit today. So this isn't a claim that I made. It's actually a quote that I stole from William James that he already made in 1890. And it's one of his most heavily cited quotes. So everyone knows what attention is. And a lot of people who give talks on attention use this exact sentence. Now, he didn't leave it at that. He did try to define attention with a little more detail. So what he said was, it is the taking possession by the mind in a clear and vivid form of one out of what seem several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, and it is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, scatterbrained state. I think he added something about there is, like, the opposite could be distraction, and for my fellow German speakers here, he used the German word Zerstreutheit as the opposite, which is very beautiful, but unfortunately not very well translates into other languages. Now, reading through this, I want to maybe look a little more closely at several parts of this sentence. So the first one, and that is already one that I think we can all maybe see as a little bit problematic, is he says, it is the taking possession by the mind, which sounds like a very active thing to do. Almost like there is something like a central self that selects among all these mental contents that are available. That is something he said in 1890, so science has evolved a little bit since, but really what we now think of is more these like distributed neural networks, some competing dynamics, and a lot of oscillatory timing mechanisms, rather than a central self that actively takes control. The next part of this definition that I also want to highlight a little bit critically is he says, it happens in a clear and vivid form, which almost sounds like it is linked to clarity and consciousness. From a lot of different mental states and also phenomena like inattentional blindness, or even when we think of patients with unilateral neglect who seem to not pay attention to some content, but consciousness seems to be a very, very different concept. Many attentional processes are unconscious. And I think it is important that we start thinking about these differences and really decoupling attentiveness from conscious awareness. The next part that he said was, it is one out of what seem several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought, which, if we're being picky, it means there is exactly one thing we pay attention to, which we also know is not true, right? We can split our attention between multiple targets, so divided attention is a thing, especially when we look at experiments that were done with visual attention. We can attend to multiple targets simultaneously. I'm putting that in quotes because the nature of this split attention is still something that is very much in question. We don't know if it is distributed probabilistically or rhythmically, or how we distribute our attention across different modalities. But we know that it is a rather flexible allocation of all our processing resources, and it isn't just one thing that we focus on. This part of his definition, the withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, that I think is a very central thing when we ask the question of why. Why is this concept of attention something that has evolved in brains? And that is, there seems to be a limited capacity to process everything that is going on internally and externally at a given time. And we somehow need to bias these different inputs in order to effectively deal with the ones that are given a higher priority because of tasks or because of instincts that select very salient stimuli in our surroundings. So this maybe answers the question of why is this concept of attention a thing? And then lastly, he phrased it as, it has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, and scatterbrained state, which the only reason why I want to point this part out is because I think it's important to notice that attention is not actually something binary. It is not the absence or the presence of attention as we know now. It's something that very much happens on a scale. It is very graded, it is very contextual, and it is multifaceted. So if we would say that the confused and dazed and scatterbrained is the opposite of attention, then we really don't give enough credit to such things as mind-wandering or spontaneous thought, because those actually do play a very important role in cognition and in a lot of other cognitive phenomena that a lot of you think about or research. The individual's attention happens on a spectrum and has a lot of functional diversity. Okay, so now I pretty much told you everything that is wrong with this definition, but I have to disappoint you. I'm not going to give you a better one. And that is for the simple reason that I don't have one. And that is the reason I'm giving this talk today. I think as we go through some of my examples, it becomes clear that while this intuitive concept of attention is something that everybody thinks they understand, as soon as we try to define it, we realize the limitations of our understanding of attention. So yeah, what levels of explanations are actually touched here? Obviously, most of his definition is more on the computational level. I think Wolfgang in his talk already mentioned these levels of explanations by Maas in the beginning. So this definition really only focuses on computational levels. So why is it important? What is the function of attention? And then it very briefly maybe hints at some algorithmic levels of attention, saying, well, there has to be some competitive selection processes, but he doesn't really specify how this withdrawal happens. And most importantly, he doesn't at all touch the implementational level, that he didn't have any understanding of that. We have come a long way since then. I won't have the time to give a whole review of all the information we have gained from neuroscience about attention. I just want to give you one example that I always thought was at least very interesting when we think about how the allocation of attention works. And that was a kind of recent paper by Ian Fiebelkorn and Sabine Kastner, who called it a rhythmic theory of attention. And what they did is they measured neurons in different parts of the cortex for their actually spiking rates. And they found that there was a theta rhythm in these spiking neurons that was somehow predictive of hit rates of monkeys when they were shown a target on screen. So there was a covert attention task for these monkeys, and when you checked whether the hit rates of a very, very briefly displayed target were high or low, then you could actually find that they corresponded with these theta rhythms in the brain. And they hypothesized that when you look at the theta rhythm, whenever you're in a low phase of your theta rhythm, there seems to be an enhanced perceptual sensitivity, so we had higher hit rates of these monkeys, whereas whenever we were in the high phase of the theta rhythm, then there was a diminished perceptual sensitivity, but a higher chance for microsaccades to occur. This was a visual task, so eye movement were presumed to be predictive of the processing that was going on. Now, what they say is that when we pay sustained and focused attention to a visual target, we don't actually have sustained attention, but we sample it rhythmically. And every now and then in between, which a theta rhythm is like 4 to 7 hertz, so 4 to 7 times per second, there seems to be a little bit of a lower perceptual sensitivity, but a higher chance for us to actually explore our surroundings. That seems like a good safety mechanism. We shouldn't be so focused on one target that we don't actually realize what else is going on around us, right? So there is increasing effort to understand the actual neural basis of what is going on in the brain in times of attention. When I had my conversations with some of you during the conference, and I talked to some people from decision making, we talked about consciousness, we even got into the whole free will debate and everything. One thing that I like to do is I try to see everything through the lens of attention. With every single one of these phenomena, I try to think about what role does attention play in this, or how can I frame this in a way that this concept of attention that I can't even define seems to play an important role. And what I found is that no matter what we talk about, I do find an angle where it can be framed as an attentional problem. So, for example, if we think about consciousness, the comparison between what is conscious and what is unconscious, if we see attention as a selection mechanism, they're at least pretty related, right? It's what makes it through the filter and becomes aware compared to what doesn't. When we think about memory, this concept of working memory, isn't it what basically we are trying to keep in our current attentional focus compared to what we're not? Obviously, perceptively, like visual perception, auditory perception, there's very famous examples such as cocktail party phenomena, suddenly listening to your name even though you thought you weren't aware of that input. And one of the main topics of this conference in general, intelligence. Whenever I think about intelligence or even learning, I try to remember how maybe what some other people do in order to learn or solve a problem might differ from how I do it, simply because I attend to different parts of the problem. I attend to different prior knowledge that I've gotten from somewhere, and just what we make available to this like new combination maybe of information that it needs to solve a problem basically is the problem of attention. What are we giving what kind of weight, right? And then decision-making, similarly, I think is heavily influenced by what we pay attention to. And I keep using this term, which I shouldn't if I argue that we don't actually know what it is, but I think you intuitively get the point that what we currently understand as attention is this one-fits-all kind of term and simultaneously a placeholder for something we can't actually explain. In my conversation yesterday before dinner, Rory called this, am I calling for almost a paradigm shift, where right now all these categories are somehow pointing at attention, saying, yeah, like, there's this thing, attention, that, sure, somehow matters. Or am I saying that ultimately attention should be at the center of this, and all these disciplines should actually try to refocus some of their effort into thinking, how can I phrase this into a problem that really puts the filter through which we see this problem, the world, this cognitive phenomenon, should we put attention in the center of that? And I don't know. I don't know if the goal should be to finally find a unifying concept of attention, or if once we actually start focusing on this concept, we will realize we've been using it as a placeholder term for a lot of slightly different processes in the brain that are involved in cognition that really deserve to be treated individually. I don't know if I'm expecting attention to become more important as a concept, or if I'm expecting it to shatter into all these individual concepts. I think a lot of that depends on what we can really get from neuroscience and how we can understand what areas of the brain are involved in maybe all of these attentional processes, or if there's different areas, also what exactly happens on a neural level during times of higher attention to certain stimuli. I don't know. I can't give you the answer. But now I'm actually going to jump topics a little bit. Even though on a machine learning level, the term attention is used very differently, I think the one thing I agree on a technical, or I think is interesting on a cognitive level, is the title. Attention is all you need. Maybe it is all we need to explain so many of these other phenomena. I don't know. But it is a term that I think yesterday in our panel discussion, somebody said the engineers listen in to the cognitive scientists or the psychologists, and then they hear a term and they kind of implement something that is loosely related, and then they said, here, I did this. And it's not actually what happens in our brain. So multi-headed attention or self-attention in transformers is cognitively not a perfect example of our brain, but it catches on some similar ideas of trying to pick out what part of my input seems to be relevant, right? So there is a lot of ambiguity. In cognitive neuroscience, I mentioned it somehow seems to be used as a placeholder for unexplained variance. In AI currently, it is a mathematically very elegant and very well-working concept that is cognitively underinterpreted. And in clinical work, it is almost a diagnostic category and a symptom cluster that has been causing increasing attention because a lot of people are saying there's this rise in ADHD, we struggle more and more with actually sustained attention and those kinds of things, which because of time reasons, I'm actually going to jump to my last little piece of monologue. Why should we care so much about attention? I think our brain evolved over a long, long period of time to be incredibly powerful. And we have recently started redesigning our world, our technology, without putting the human in the center and the human capabilities in the center. And I think a lot of these developments, especially with technology, are very unaware of what human attentional mechanisms are actually capable to do and how they develop. And that is what I think causes almost an inhibition of the actual computational power that our brain has. So why should we care about attention? I think understanding attentional mechanisms in the brain will give us the ability to design our world in a way that takes away so much of the distraction and the inhibition of this development of attentional mechanisms and therefore very intelligent behavior, and would possibly result in technology and a world that is better suited for our own attentional needs. So my takeaway message is, if anything, then I hope everyone walks out of here at least considering how does attention play a role in the questions that I'm trying to answer on any level. If you're an AI researcher, if you're a cognitive scientist, or even on a neural level, how have I treated attention thus far? Do I think of it as this, like, explain away some of the variance, or am I willing to think about the actual effect that attention has? And then the bigger goal is, when we think about designing our world, I do think it is important to put the human back in the center and become aware of attentional mechanisms of human to make that actually fit our brains. And that was my thought.
Really quick one. Just curious what your conclusion was on free will.
So I think the discussion about free will started from a discussion about consciousness a little bit, where we were saying, so what becomes available to us, how much is that deterministic or not? And we went back to that same discussion, or to that same conclusion of, if we don't understand exactly, like on a neural level, how attention influences, how like neural activation is influenced by attention, and basically it's all a question of cause and effect. Like, if we are able to track down where this like change in neural activity really is caused, then that can tell us a lot about whether there is like a determinism in brain states or not. But we didn't come to a conclusion about free will. It was we're very, very curious to see all the perspectives, but there was no conclusion.
Hello, thanks. I have actually a comment and question about the slide at near the very beginning, where you put attention in the middle, and then intelligence, and then perception and consciousness that just spans from attention. I actually have a slightly different opinion about, in particular about consciousness, its relation with the rest of these concepts. And I think it's, I actually see it as a kind of counter-proportional relationship between consciousness and perception and attention in particular. Because one example that describes it is the Necker's cube, whether you can see it as pointing up or pointing down, right? So you are obviously, everyone who's familiar with the physical world can get attracted, like your attention will dwell on one of the orientations. And then depending on the contrast of the edges, or just the contrast of the surfaces of the Necker's cube, if some of the edges are dimmed, then your attention will be more easily attracted to one of the orientation versus the other. And that is the case where you need more consciousness to consciously revert your perception for the orientation of the cube, right? So I think attention is more of a causal effect that arises from perception, and consciousness is the opposite of that. So I would see consciousness as the counterpart of our decision-making, our perception of selves, etc. Right? Because consciousness helps the losing part of the competition win.
Okay, I have a slightly different understanding. So I think what you said was you need more consciousness to see it in one way or the other. I don't think that is, yes, I don't think that requires more or less consciousness. I think how I would phrase it is a very intentional allocation of computation to different things from your perception, where maybe when you first see it, then it's depending on your prior, you see it in a certain way, and then what is required is an exogenous relocation of attentional resources to see it in a different way. I don't think it requires more or less consciousness. I think they require the same level of consciousness. But that's my understanding of consciousness as the opposite of unconscious. I don't think when we see an image that is ambiguous, there is one that is conscious and one that is unconscious. If that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Lisa.